chapter 18. This is what Shir is entitled the Shiloh Plan. And as you can imagine, we're going to talk about Shiloh. So we started this chapter last week, and we spent the Shir focusing primarily on the mission that Yehoshua sends the remaining tribes on, namely to take 3 representatives of each tribe, Shoshanim L'Shabbat, Anashim L'Shabbat. There are 7 tribes that still have to identify, map out their land, their Nachala, and go and conquer and settle it. And you have to divide the land into 7 parts and bring back the report of the names of the cities, the fortification of the cities, the quality of the cities to me here in Shiloh, says Yehoshua, and I will cast the lots to confirm your division of the land, more or less essentially what we said last week. So Yehoshua sends out, and we spent some time comparing this role of these 3 people per tribe to the role of the Nisim or the Meraglim in Parshat Shlach and Dvarim. I'm not going to rehash that, but we kind of broke down the role of the Goral versus the role of the cartographers that Yehoshua sends to map out the land. What I want to do today is take us a step back to why we're in Shiloh. Because we kind of glossed over the fact that the text begins, Vayikahalu kol adat b'nei Yisrael Shiloh. The entire congregation gathered in Shiloh. Vayashkinu sham et ol moed, and there they placed, from the word Mishkan, lashkin sham, to set up the tent of meeting, the Mishkan. Ve'aretz nichbesha lifnehem, the land was conquered or subdued before them. Kind of glossed over, A, what are they doing in Shiloh, and B, what's the connection between the first half of this verse and the second? What they're doing in Shiloh is the big question, because up until this point in time, the Mishkan, as we understand it, that it came in from the Midbar, they crossed over the Yarden, and they set up camp in Gilgal, and they've been in Gilgal ever since. This is the first moment we're hearing of any kind of placement of the Mishkan outside of Gilgal, meaning in its proper place. If you put Gilgal and Shiloh together, you get Gilgal, but that's a separate, right? It was a slip of the tongue. But this is the first reference to them outside of Gilgal in the adjusting the air in Shiloh, and that's more, and that's the big question. What are they doing in Shiloh, and why does the story of the Mishkan suddenly take a role in the sequence of the book? The text is dealing primarily with the conquest of the land of Israel, the dividing of the Nachala, the settlement of each land. We haven't mentioned the Mishkan at all, maybe once or twice. Up until now, everything has been in Gilgal, and I'll show you on a map. Actually, I'll show you on this map, which I shared with you once at the very beginning of the course. It's somewhere on the website earlier. If you want afterwards, I'll send it to you. But this is a map of the whole area. We'll see this map in a few minutes again. As they crossed over the Yarden just north of the Dead Sea, here's Yericho, here's Gilgal. This has been their camp up until this point. After every major battle, they've gone back to Gilgal. And suddenly they're in Shiloh. And the Mishkan is in Shiloh. So that is that's the mystery. I'm just going to take care of one thing here. Sorry, I apologize for that. I need to should have done that before. Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing and reshare. Give me a moment. Okay. So my focus for tonight is to try to understand what is Shiloh, where did Shiloh come from in the story, and why suddenly this chapter places the Mishkan in Shiloh, and it'll stay there for the duration of a good chunk of Tanakh history, almost 400 years. This is just, I mean, it kind of gets a casual mention here, but Yikalu Koladat B'nai Israel, Shiloh, suddenly they're in Shiloh, and there they put the Mishkan. And that's it. And it's not going to change until Shlomo HaMelech. Maybe actually until beginning of Shmuel. And that's it. Beginning of Shmuel Aleph. So that's the first question. To kind of walk us through the background to Shiloh, we have to go back to Chumash and to the moment in which the Torah describes what to do with the Mishkan that they had in the desert for 40 years. They were traveling. The Mishkan was a traveling sanctuary. It was a traveling mizbeach, essentially, the altar, which would go from place to place. And now they were coming into the land of Israel. What were they going to do with this mizbeach, with this altar, and this tabernacle? So let's take a quick look at the psukim in Dvarim Yud Bet. And some of this is on the source page. This is source number 2, but I'm going to show it to you here. This is in Parshat Ve'eh, part of the description of the unique role of the Mizbeach, of the altar in the land of Israel. One of the things that we were commanded and charged to do, we talked about this at the beginning of the study of Yehoshua, it was to destroy the places of idolatry, to destroy the altars of idolatry that existed there at the time, because they worshiped God on every mountain, on every hill. They worshiped their gods. Whereas, we are commanded not to do what the Canaanites did, but rather, the place that God will choose from amongst your tribes, Lasum et shemo sham, to place his name there, Lishichno tidrshu uvata shama. There you shall seek his name, and there you shall come. Seek his presence, the Shulman. And there you will bring your offerings, and there you will bring your tithes, and there you will bring your nidavot and your neders, and there you will bring all your offerings, liminahem of whatever they are. They're the mizbeach will function. You will eat the sacrificial offerings there before God. You will rejoice before God. You will no longer be able to do what we do here. What do we do here? Ish kol yashar be'inav, every man what is right in his own eyes. It's a phrase which we'll explore and break down in our study of Sefer Shoftim. For now, I'm going to leave it and continue. Ki lo vatem adata ala menucha ve'ala nachala asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach. Today you have, I'm going to translate this into halachic terms. Today you have a traveling mizbeach. Mizbeach could be here, mizbeach could be there. There is a mishkan, it could travel around. That was true when we were in the desert. But now you're coming into the land of Israel. You're coming into your place of rest, your menucha. You're coming into your inheritance, to your nachala. And therefore you're coming into your place of permanence, asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach. So when you come to your place of permanence, your menucha and nachala, va'avartem et hayarden yishavtem ba'aretz, you cross the Yarden, you will dwell in the land, asher Hashem Elokecha menachil etchem. And then God, after you conquer the land, He will give you respite from all rest from all your enemies surrounding you, and you will dwell securely. Then then the place that God will choose from amongst all the places of all the tribes to place His name there, that chosen place, Shama taviu et kol asher anochim mitzvah etchem. There you will bring your offerings. There you will build your mizbeach. So, what does the Torah tell us about where the permanent home of the mizbeach / Mishkan is intended to be and when. So the where is complicated because we have a historical hindsight of Yerushalayim, the place of the Bet HaMikdash, etc., Rabbi, first temple, second temple. But leaving that out aside for a moment, the Torah's description of the place is undefined. That place which God will choose. So the place is to be determined. When will they come to that place of permanence? When they come into the land of Israel, when they conquer it, you will dwell in the land, and God will give you respite from all your enemies. You will dwell securely. Then you will come el haminucha ve'el hanachala, to your rest, to your place of your menucha, where you will rest from wars, ve'el hanachala, and to your inheritance, and you will choose a place of God's choosing, and you will place the mizbeach there. So based on those verses, one could argue, again, we know nothing about Yerushalayim, we know nothing in history, we are a tabula rasa, we are starting from scratch, and we walk into the beginning of Perek Yudchet, and we read, Vayikalu kol adat b'nei Yisrael Shiloh, they come to Shiloh, Vayashkinu sham et Or Moed, and there they place the Mishkan in Or Moed. V'ha'aretz nichbesha lifnehem, the land was conquered, was subdued before them. And one could make the argument that what the text here is saying is, we've reached that point in time in which the land has been conquered, while Nachalo, the Menucha, everything is done, we're ready to place the Mishkan in its final and permanent place. We're missing the piece about God choosing it, but okay, let's make that assumption. Okay, missing one piece, but we can make that assumption. At least one major Rishon read the text in exactly that way. As much as it kind of grates against our nerves to suggest that the permanent place of the Mishkan would be anywhere other than Yerushalayim, that at least the way it is read by one major Rishon. And now we can jump to the source page. It gives you a sense of where Shiloh is. Shiloh is in the heart of what we refer to as, in the Tanakh terms, as Yar Ephraim. It's in the heart of Shevet Ephraim. We'll talk about its role and which tribe it belongs in next week's class. But I want to take a look at this parish, Rav Yosef, Rav Shimon Karo, also known as Mari Karo, very different from Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. This was in 11th century, 12th century Ashkenaz, a very important Parshan. And he writes the following. He quotes the beginning of the verse, Vayikalu kol adat b'nei Yisrael Shiloh v'yashkinu sham et Or Moed v'ha'aretz nichbesha lifnehem, placed the Mishkan in Shiloh and the land was subdued, says Rav Yosef Karo, Kibush ha'aretz gorem levayashkinu sham et Or Moed. The conquest of the land enables the placement of the Mishkan in Shiloh. Once the land was conquered, nivchara Shiloh makom shchina. The place of Shiloh was chosen, using that term from the Torah, as the place of the Shechina, as the place of the divine presence and the Mizbeach. As it says, and here he quotes the whole sequence of verses that I just showed you. Etc. In other words, says Rabbi Yosef Karo, it's this very simple observation. Once the conquest is done, which is now where we're at after 14 years of conquest and 14 years of Nachla, and 7 years of conquest, 7 years of division, we're at that point in time whether we need a final and permanent place for the Mishkan. God chooses Shiloh. Yehoshua moves the Mishkan to Shiloh. And that's the assumption. This is reflected a little bit in the Mishnah in Zvachim. The Mishnah in Zvachim, reflected and challenged a little bit. The Mishnah in Zvachim says, there's a series of Mishnayos in the 14th parak of Tractate Zvachim, distinguishing all the places where the Mishkan eventually lived. The Mishkan starts in Gilgal, which is prior to this, it's temporary place, and then it comes to Shiloh. Once the Mishkan comes to Shiloh, and remember, in halachic terms, the Mishkan is really the Mizbech. So even though we're thinking Ark, and we're thinking Raiders of the Lost Ark, and we're thinking, that kind of, but really from a functional perspective, and certainly in Tanakh, and in the Psukim in the Torah's emphasis here was on where to place the Mizbeach, and therefore where to bring the Korbanot. So from the perspective of the Mizbeach, it comes to Shiloh. At that point, Ne'esu habamot. At that point, private altars become prohibited. The idea was that once the Mishkan entered its permanent home, people could no longer build their own private altars and bring their own korbanot. You had to have one place. That was a reference to that pasuk in Dvarim that said you can't do what the Canaanites do today, that everybody builds their own altar. Now you have one mizbeach. Essentially, the theology of it is one God, one altar, one temple, one service. It's built into the foundation of monotheism that there's only one place of the mizbeach. And so once it comes to a permanent home in Shiloh, those private altars became prohibited. Now, the problem is that it doesn't stay permanently in Shiloh. It comes to Shiloh, but we know that 370 years later or so, the Mishkan is destroyed at the beginning of Sefer Shmuel Aleph, in the fifth chapter. The Plishtim come and they capture the ark and they destroy the Mishkan. They raise Shiloh to the ground, and the Mizbeach goes into exile. The Mizbeach goes to the city of Nov, and there it will remain for a number of years until Shaul HaMelech, in his fixation and paranoia about David HaMelech, goes and destroys the city of Nov and kills all the Kohanim in Sefer Shmuel Bet, and then the Mizbeach goes to Givon, and the Aron goes to Kiryat Yearim. Anyway, there it stays until it comes eventually to Yerushalayim in the days of David HaMelech. And once the Mishkan and the Mizbeach and the Aron come back to Yerushalayim, then Ne'esu Abamot, then from that point again, private altars become prohibited, meaning we have one place of worship. However, says the Mishnah, Lo haya lehen heter. After that, there was no longer any possibility of a permissible time of private altars, meaning Yerushalayim was the final and permanent place of the Mizbeach, and even if Yerushalayim were to be destroyed, there could never be an allowance to build a new Mizbeach until Yerushalayim was rebuilt. And that, says the Mishnah, is a reference to the word nachla, in contrast to the word menucha. If you go back to the text in Dvarim, it says that the description of this place, which will be a permanent place for the Mishkan, is described as a menucha and a nachala, your resting and inheritance of land. So the Mishnah says you can bifurcate those phrases. You can have menucha without nachala and nachala without menucha. So the Mishnah says that the Shiloh, in which the Mishkan stood for 369 years, was a long place. That was menucha. But it wasn't permanent. It wasn't nachala. It wasn't inheritance. And it doesn't take on that accolade, that description, until Yerushalayim, until the nachala of Yerushalayim. So Ela menucha ve'ela nachala refers to Shiloh at the beginning, and then eventually to Yerushalayim. That's how we understand the halacha. That's in hindsight how we perceive the story of the Mishkan. It starts in Shiloh for 369 years, gets destroyed, then eventually it comes to Yerushalayim, to the Beit HaMikdash, to the story of David HaMelech. And David, in fact, in the beginning of Shmuel Bet, Perek Zayin, when David comes to Natan HaNavi, and he says to him, David is sitting in his throne in Yerushalayim. And God gave him respite, rest from all of his enemies. Suddenly we have a reference to that verse in Devarim that says that when God gives you rest from all your enemies and you dwell securely, then you will build the permanent place, the Makom HaShev Hashem. David took that as a reference to his moment in history. God had given him rest from all his enemies. Jewish people, the expanse of the land of Israel, etc. So the king, David, says to Natan HaNavi, I'm sitting in a house made of cedar. The ark is sitting in a tent. The ark is sitting in a place of curtains. The ark is sitting in exile because we haven't yet brought the ark and the altar back together after its destruction in Shiloh. So Natan says to him initially, whatever is good in your eyes, do, and that's where he wants to build the temple, and then he retracts that for reasons that we'll have to look at when we study Sefer Shmuel. But this is that moment when we think we could build the Beit HaMikdash. It ends up getting delayed for a generation. But all this assumes that Shiloh is a temporary stop along the way. We have Menucha and we have Nachala, and Shiloh is the Menucha, and Yerushalayim is the Nachal. And therefore, after Shiloh was destroyed, they could go back to a time of private altars. After Yerushalayim was destroyed, you cannot. Yerushalayim is permanent, Shiloh is not. That is the assumption here in all of this text. Comes along with Yosef Karo with a bombshell and suggests that when Yeshua moved the Mishkan to Shiloh, he did not do so with any intent of temporariness, but rather Vayashkinu Shemat Ol Moed Kibush Haaretz Gorem LeVayashkinu Shemat Ol Moed Nivchara Shiloh Makom Shechina. Once the conquest is done, the Mishkan is permanently placed in the place that God will choose. And just in case we could argue that Yosef Karo didn't mean it exactly that way. I'll jump over the Radak for a second. We'll come back to it maybe. But take a look of David Tzvi Hoffman, much later, a more contemporary scholar. But what he says about this question is exactly this. He says, if you look at the Gemara in Zvachim, I'll read this in a second, but if you look at the Gemara in Zvachim, the Gemara entertains an opinion, not an opinion that we pass by, but the Gemara entertains an opinion that Menucha and Nachla, Tana de Bedem Ishmael, Zovazo Shiloh, are both referring to Shiloh. Not as the Mishnah identified that Menucha is Shiloh, Nachla is Yerushalayim, step 1, step 2. Says Rabbi Ishmael, no, it's all Shiloh. And therefore it translates the words Menucha, that they rested from conquest, they finished the conquest, and Nachla divided up the tribes, and as they said, Yeshua divided up all the tribes by a goral, and we're done. Jewish history's come to its climax. Says Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, and he quotes this Breita, that's the significance of coming to Shiloh. Tkufat hamenucha hashlema hazot omnam lo ba ela rak b'malchuto shel David. Historically, we know that eventually it was only during the time of David that we conquered the entire land. They had some kind of rest at this point. And this is a mind-blowing observation. He said, they didn't put the Mishkan in Shiloh because Shiloh had some historical significance. They put the Mishkan somewhere and called the city Shiloh. Shiloh was the place of the Mishkan, meaning Lashon Shalva, from the word Shalom. And in Yaakov's bracha to his children, he talks about Yehuda leading his people ad ki yavo Shiloh. And there's a huge machloket what the word Shiloh means in the brachot of Yaakov. Says Rav Hoffman, v'yesh lefresh ad asher yavo el ir shalvuto. This is the city of peace, the city of the place of tranquility. This is the permanent place of the Mishkan, and place of Shalom and Shalva. Named so because the Mishkan was there, not the other way around. That's why we have such an opinion. Now listen to what he writes. Had we remained loyal to God, Shiloh nish'eret lechalutin makom menucha. Shiloh would have been the permanent home of the Mishkan and the Mikdash forever. Because the Torah doesn't name the city. The Torah just says that place, well, God will choose. Well, had we not sinned, that place would have been permanent. But God destroyed the Mishkan in Shiloh, as we read about in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, and we read about in Tehillim, Vayitosh Mishkan Shiloh Oel Sheken Ba'adam. He abandoned the Mishkan in Shiloh. And therefore, afterwards, Nivcheret Yerushalayim was chosen. But David Tzvi Hoffman argues it was an historical reaction to our own sins. If we not sinned, then the Mishkan would have stayed in Shiloh permanently. Which is really quite an extraordinary observation. In many ways, it makes sense, because otherwise, why would you go, if you know that it's temporary, why would you take the Mishkan and move it from Gilgal? Just wait till the conquest is finished, ask God where the permanent place of the Mishkan should be, and go there. Right? Why move it to Shiloh if that Shiloh is not intended to be the permanent location? So this is the debate amongst the Mefarshim, whether or not the move to Shiloh is a temporary one, in which case, what is the phrase, the land was conquered before them, were subdued, mean? Or that the intent was a permanent movement to move to Shiloh because the conquest was done. We'll analyze that in a second. The Radak has a kind of navigates a little bit of a middle of the road here. He says that after the 14 years of conquest and seven of conquest, 7 of division, then the Ol Moed, in which the Ol Moed, the Mishkan was in Gilgal, and then it was moved to Shiloh, and it remained in Shiloh in the kind of a semi-permanent state. What does a semi-permanent state mean? It was made out of stone, reflecting permanence, Bayit Shalavanim Milamata. But the roof of the Mishkan was always the Yiriyot, was always the curtains that traveled with them in the desert. In other words, it had both the status of a Bayit, permanence, and an Ohel, temporary. And it's referred to as a Bayit, Beit Hashem Shiloh, and it's referred to as an Ohel when it was destroyed. The Torah and the Rabbi says, Vayitosh Mishkan Shiloh Ohel Shiken Ba'adam. What's the quasi-permanent state? It was in Shiloh for 369 years. That's quasi-permanent, meaning it had a long-term longevity in this place, but not permanent in the sense that it was always eventually going to be moved. Although it stood in Shiloh for 369 years, the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim only stood for 410 years. So I'm not sure that the order of magnitude here, one reflects permanence, one reflects temporariness in this regard. Says Rabbi Yosef Karo, says Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman, that's not so. This was always intended to be a permanent move to Shiloh because, and I come back to the text, because, sorry, where is it? Vayikalu koladat b'nei Yisrael Shiloh, and there they placed the Mishkan because ha'aretz nichbesha lifnehem, because the land had been conquered, subdued before them. That's the question. And I am going to challenge both these interpretations and share with you Rashi, and then we'll kind of navigate around that too, because ask a simple question. Is this correct? Is this accurate? The land was subdued before them. They're done. They've reached Minucha ve'Nachala. They've finished the conquest of Israel. They've finished the settlement. They're done. They're done. They can now go to a permanent place for the Mishkan and Shiloh. Is that what the text is telling me? But forget for a moment the question of what the historical evidence points to. What does this text mean? Does this text mean that they have now reached the final finished chapter in the conquest and division of the land of Israel? They can move to a permanent place for the Mishkan? Is that what it means? Read literally 2 psukim more. The Mishkan comes, they gather everybody in Shiloh. There they place the Mishkan. The land was subdued before them. We'll see what that means. But there are 7 tribes who have yet not received their inheritance. So how could you say they're done, and then in the same breath, next verse, say, oh, but there are 7 out of 12. I mean, that's more than half that haven't reached their inheritance. And Yehoshua scolds them for it. Vayomer Yehoshua b'nei Yisrael, how long are you going to be slack in your possession, in taking and settling the land? Then he sends them on a mission. So, okay, so let's deal with it. And the mission that he sends them is to do exactly what it would seem this verse reflects. He sends 21 people, 3 per tribe of the 7 remaining tribes, to go and map out the land, and then bring back the message, the list of the land, the location, and the division, and everything, to be able to bring to throw the goral and to get God's confirmation. Where will all that take place? That's not in the base camp in Gilgal. That is in Shiloh. Right? How many times in this text does he emphasize that they're now in Shiloh? I'll show you an interesting. I love this website for many reasons. This alhatorah.org. But one of them is this little. It's called a Tanakh lab. You can take any text in the Torah, in Tanakh, anywhere, and you can analyze the sequencing of every verse, phrase, sequence of verses, etc. You can click on a word, and it'll tell you how many times it appears in this text and how many times it appears in the rest of Tanakh. It's an interesting text. Vayikalu is irrelevant to me. I want to look at Shiloh. And suddenly I realized in one short passage of 10 verses, Shiloh is mentioned no less than 4 times. He gathers everybody together in Shiloh. And then he says the 7 tribes that haven't yet divided the land, go to bring me 3 people per tribe, go out and write the list of the cities, come back here. V'yariti lechem goral po lifnei Hashem Elokeinu. Here before God. What does here before God mean? Here before God in Shiloh. Then he says, well, there's 7 because we talked about that. They get up to go. Yehoshua gives him a final message, and he says, "L'chu v'hitalchu ba'aretz," like Avraham Avinu, "Kum hitalech ba'aretz." Kitvu ota, write down the cities. V'shuvu elai upo ashlich lechem goral. Here I will make the goral. Lifnei Hashem b'Shiloh, before God in Shiloh. And then they go and they write the cities and they bring back V'yavol Yehoshua el machaneh Shiloh. They come to Yehoshua in the camp in Shiloh. V'yashlech lahem Yehoshua goral b'Shiloh. Yehoshua throws the goral in Shiloh, lifnei Hashem, before God. 4 times in 10 verses to tell me that we're not in Gilgal anymore. We're not in Kansas. Forgive the expression. We're not in Gilgal. We're now in Shiloh. And if there's any mistake about it, the goral is before God, and before God means before the Aron, and the Aron is in Shiloh. Don't go make the mistake. Don't go back to Gilgal. We're here in Shiloh. It's a whole new ballgame. And after the whole division of the tribes, after Binyamin is in chapter 18, and then in chapter 19, you have the rest of the tribes, the very last verse. These are the nachalot that were given, divided by Elazar, by Yehoshua, by the heads of the tribes. With the goral in Shiloh. This chapter is bracketed by the move to Shiloh and the goral before God in Shiloh. Make no mistake about it. This is a new ballgame. The Mishkan is at home in Shiloh. The question is why? Did we go to Shiloh because the land was conquered and we're done? As the Radatz Hoffman says, as Rabbi Yosef Kara says. Or did we go to Shiloh for some other reason? Because we're not done. We clearly are not done. There's still 7 tribes to go and settle their land. So what is the Haaretz B'Shalif Nehem? The land was conquered before them mean. So because of all of this, I believe Rashi took a different track altogether. Rashi says the following, and again, I believe what Rashi is trying to address is the reaction to all that we saw above. We didn't go to Shiloh because the land conquest was finished. That would not make sense because we hadn't. Says Rashi, Ve'aretz nichbasha lifnehem means Mishenikba hamishkan hayta haaretz nocha likabesh lifnehem. Once the Mishkan was established in Shiloh, it would be easier to finish the conquest of the land. In other words, what Rashi does is he reverses course. He says, we didn't go to Shiloh because the land we're finished with the conquest. We went to Shiloh because we're not finished with the conquest. And we needed something to open up the land. What would open up the land before them? The Mishkan, a permanent home for the Mishkan. So the permanent home for the Mishkan, a permanent home for the Shekhinah, would give them the divine providence they needed to conquer the rest of the land. Nocha should be easier to conquer, and that's the meaning of the phrase, V'aretz nichbasha lifnehem, the land was subdued before them. In other words, the way I read this Rashi, there's a principle in Parshanut, interpretation of text in Tanakh, referred to as klal v'achareha maaseh, a general statement followed by the details of how it came about. I've shared this with you once before. It's Chazal's explanation, for example, as to the famous contradiction between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Breshit. Chapter 1 in Breshit describes the creation of Adam and Eve as Zachar and Nekeva, male and female. Chapter 2 describes a process where Adam is created first and then the Chava created from him. Says the Medrash, you have in a general statement first, that's chapter 1, and then the details of how it came about in chapter 2. Another example is in Megillat Esther, where in chapter 8, let me show you that quickly. Chapter 8 begins, on that day, Achashverosh gave Esther the house of Haman, and Mordechai came before him, and Vayasa Melech Tabato, the king took his ring and he gave it that he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordechai. So now Mordechai has Achashverosh's ring, verse 2. Then verse 3 begins that Esther comes before the king and she begs him to remove the evil decree of Haman. And the king says, there's nothing I can do about an evil decree. Whatever Haman made, I can't retract it. But I've given you his house. I've hanged him on a tree. Go and write whatever you want, and sign it with the ring of the king. Now, Achashverosh doesn't enable them to do anything they didn't already have the power to do, because in verse 2 already, Achashverosh gave Mordechai Haman Achashverosh's ring, which he took from Haman. So this is a mystery. What happened here? The simplest explanation is that verse 1 and 2 is an introduction. This is the story of how Mordechai gets Achashverosh's ring, which was taken from Haman. Headline. Now the details. Esther came and Esther begged, etc. And Achashverosh finally said, okay, here's the ring. I took from Haman, I'm giving it to you. That's how I would see Rashi's interpretation here. Headline, title, Shiloh, new home of Mishkan. The land now is able to be finished the conquest, finished the division. Why does it need to be finished? Because there were 7 tribes that hadn't yet conquered. So Yehoshua says to them, okay, go and draw it out, and I will throw the goral, and I'll make the goral, we'll have a nevuah, and we'll divide the rest of the remaining land. Now that the Mishkan is in Shiloh, there is a place called Lifnei Hashem, there's a place called before God that we can establish as the place for the Shekhinah. We can make the goral here, and it will enable the remaining conquest of the land. That's Rashi's observation, a powerful interpretation, essentially saying that A leads to B. Okay, that A is the cause of B. The fact that they go to Shiloh, they didn't go to Shiloh because the land was conquered and finished. They went to Shiloh in order to enable the land to be conquered and finished. Okay. And that's very logical, very powerful. It doesn't explain to me why Shiloh. That answer to that question you're going to have to come back next week for, because I'm not going to get to why Shiloh today. But I am still bothered by one thing. And that is, according to Rashi, if that's the case, I have to ask ourselves the question, was Yehoshua successful in what he set out to do in moving the Mishkan to Shiloh? If moving the Mishkan to Shiloh, by giving a permanent home to the Mishkan, to the Shekhinah, was, says the text, a way of making it easier to conquer the land, why does the text tell us now that it was less easy to conquer the remaining land, not more so? In other words, what tribes remain? We've seen 5 tribes have received their portion, 7 tribes have yet to receive their portion. So the 5 tribes that have received the portion of Reuven, Gad, Menashe, east of the Yarden, Menashe, Yehuda in the south, and Ephraim in the north. And those are the tribes that have succeeded before the Mishkan came to Shiloh. The remaining tribes, we assume, if Rashi is correct, should be more successful at their conquest than the previous tribes, because now there's a permanent home to the Mishkan. That's what Rashi's arguing. Without getting into a lot of the gory details, chapter 18 deals with Binyamin. Chapter 19 will deal with Shimon, and will deal with Zvulun and Naphtali and Asher and Gad and Dan. Gad is on the east side, Dan, etc. Here's a map. I've shown you this map before. Okay, the orange is, by the end of Sefer Yehoshua, the orange is the Israelite conquest. The yellow is the Canaanite strongholds that they're unsuccessful at capturing. This is Judah. This is Reuben, Gad, and Menashe. This is Menashe. This is Ephraim. That's the 5 tribes before we move the Mishkan to Shiloh. Since we moved the Mishkan to Shiloh, we have Binyamin. Dan, who is totally unsuccessful, he has to go up north and be Sefer Shoftim. Naphtali, who's a little enclave here in the north. Zvulun, nothing, it's all yellow here. Asher, it's all yellow over there. I'm missing some. Shimon doesn't even have land. It's got a couple of cities. I'm missing some. The whole point of Rashi is that once you move the Mishkan to Shiloh, it becomes easier because there's a Shekhinah, there's divine providence, there's a divine help to the tribes. They'll conquer more than they conquered before. All evidence points to the opposite. And in fact, if you read there's a summary of this whole story at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. The opening chapter of Sefer Shoftim, where did I put it? Here. The opening chapter of Sefer Shoftim, and I think I actually charted this out for you on the source page, I did, is a summary of all the places that the tribes of Israel were unable, who conquered, who didn't conquer. It's essentially a summary of Sefer Yehoshua. If we go to the end of it, we find the following references. Okay, Ephraim, we talked about last week, were unable to conquer Gezer. Okay, the Canaanites remained in Gezer. Zvulun, let's go through the checklist. Zvulun lo harishit yoshvei Kitron, they didn't drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. Vayeshev ha'Knaani b'kirbo vayulamas. The Canaanites remained in their presence. That's what it says about Zvulun. Asher, lo harishit yoshvei Akko, they weren't able to drive out the inhabitants of Akko, nor of Tzidon, nor of Achlav, nor of Achziv, nor at Chalba, nor at Afik, nor at Rechov. Vayeshev ha'Asheri bekerev ha'Knaani. The Asherites lived amongst the Canaanites. In other words, we've reversed course. Up until now, conquest was conquered, tribe conquered its territory, and there might have been a Canaanite city here or there that remained unconquered, and the Canaanite city dwelt amongst the tribe. Suddenly it's the tribe of Asher who is dwelling amongst the Canaanites, and the Canaanites are described as the inhabitants of the land, Yoshvei Haaretz. Because if you look at the map, Asher's up here, and Asher did very little to take their territory to be able to settle in their land, rightly or wrongly, but that's a fact. Naphtali, lo harishit yoshvei beit Shemesh, v'lo yoshvei beit Anat, v'yeshe b'kerev ha'knani, yoshvei haaretz. Naphtali was unable to take the inhabitants of Beit Shemesh or Beit Anat, and the Canaan, Naphtali dwelt amongst the Canaanites, the masters of the land. Dan Bechalal didn't even get a foothold in the mountains. They forced Dan all the way up north. Dan had no portion of the land. What we call today Gush Dan, which is the most populated Israelite area in the land of Israel, was in the time of Tanakh. They were unable to conquer because the Canaanites had all the chariots. So they forced Dan up north. And they were completely unsuccessful. Oops, sorry. And continues on and on. In other words, I would argue that either something happened and the plan, as Rashi describes it, failed, or maybe we have to fine-tune the interpretation. Because what Rashi is suggesting is that the moment they put the Mishkan in Shiloh, it should have been easier for them to conquer, not harder, and yet all evidence points to the opposite. So what I'm going to suggest is a slight variation in Rashi. We're going to reverse Rashi. Meaning, Rashi says now that they have the Mishkan, it'll be easier to conquer. I'm going to argue that when the Aretz Nichbesha Lifnehem was not a statement, but a challenge. The land needed to become subdued. The land still needed to be conquered. At this moment in history, in chapter 18 of Sefer Yehoshua, Yehoshua is faced with a problem, a challenge. Where has base camp been up until this point? Where has the Mishkan been? It's temporary structure with the wooden posts and a temporary nature, and the Mizbeach, everything. They took the Mishkan from the desert and they brought it and they placed it in Gilgal. And the camp of Yehoshua, the army, the national headquarters of the army of Israel, has been the tents of the camp at Gilgal. And every time they've had a battle, they had a battle in the south, they had a battle in the north, they fought as a single army, they came back and they encamped at Gilgal. But we're not in the 7 years of conquest. We're at the end of 7 years of the effort of Yehoshua to get every tribe to go and conquer/settle their territory. Yehoshua has been trying for the last 7 years to break up the camp in Gilgal, to send them home, so to speak, to send Yehuda south, to send Ephraim north, to send Dan east, west, to send Naphtali and Asher north. Go to your tribes, go to your territory. And every time they go into battle, they come back to Gilgal. And I would argue the fact that to an extent, that we've reached a point in the story of the conquest of Israel in which the camp in Gilgal has now become a crutch. It's become too easy for them to simply go back to headquarters and not to challenge themselves by settling new land and dealing with the Canaanites and going out to their territory. So some were successful. Yehuda went first. Yehuda went and conquered their land. And Ephraim and Manasseh and Ephraim went second. And Manasseh is already there. Okay. But there's 7 tribes left. In this context of this moment in history, what have we done? Yehuda's taken their land. Ephraim and Manasseh already had theirs. Reuben got a Manasseh from Chumash. What have we accomplished in all of the conquest of Yehoshua? Manasseh, Ephraim, and Judah. Where are the rest of them? They're all in Gilgal. And Yeshua says, Rebbe, this can't continue. So what do? You push and you push and you push and you push, and they keep coming back home. Right? Like you'll forgive the expression and forgive me if I don't mean to offend anybody, like the grown-up child who won't move out of the house. Right? Get him out. So what do? You do something drastic, you do something dramatic. In this case, Yehoshua takes the entire camp at Gilgal and he breaks it down. He disbands it. Even the Mishkan, they keep coming back to the Mishkan. Okay, so you know what? The Mishkan's moving. It's going to have a new home. And that home's going to be in Shiloh. And you know what the advantage of Shiloh is? We'll come to, I said I wouldn't talk about why. We won't talk about why. But it happens to be that Shiloh is dead center of the country. From a geographic perspective of what's been conquered, this is really the center, physical center. So, okay, so the Mishkan will be here. And from here you can go and you can go and live in your tribes. And if you want to come to the Mishkan, you come to Mishkan. It's literally in the middle of the country. But this is how I would read the opening verses. Yehoshua gathers the people of Israel together in Shiloh, and there he places the Ol Moed, because the land still needed to be conquered before them. 7 tribes still remained unsettled in their land. And Yehoshua says to them, how long are you going to stay here? You can't stay here. Move, go home, go to your tribe, go to your territory. How long are you going to be lazy? Lazy because they keep coming back to Gilgal. No, Gilgal doesn't exist anymore. You have no choice. Come here, bring me the goral, I'll do it for you here, but here is now in Shiloh. And Shiloh for sure is not in the tribe of Naphtali, and Shiloh is not in the tribe of Zebulun, and Shiloh is not in the tribe of Dan. Shiloh is in the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim's not in the equation, they already have their land. But the rest of you, go. And that's the mandate. Yeshua brings the Mishkan to Shiloh. I call it the Shiloh plan, because it was Yeshua's plan. That's why it was temporary, because he didn't go to Shiloh because that was the permanent home of the Mishkan. He went to Shiloh because he needed a place that was not Gilgal. Break it up. Go home. Go to your land. Go to your territory. And therefore, they're more or less successful based on how much they drive that issue. Ephraim was more successful. Binyamin was more successful. Naphtali had different tribes. Okay, we'll talk about that, B'ezrat Hashem, next chapter, but more importantly, in the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. But that was his mandate. That was his mission. And Shiloh would become a new central place of the Mishkan, of Avodas Hashem. Now, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the Medrash, and here I would argue maybe even the source of the Medrash. There's a Medrash about the story of the spies, which I never understood, and I always thought it was such a strange Medrash. That the spies failed because they were motivated by the spiritual home of the desert. They wanted to stay in the desert forever. They loved living amongst by the Shekhinah, proximity to the Mishkan. They didn't have to work. They didn't have to do anything. They could live under the man in the morning, and they had Gan Eden in this world. And therefore, they came back with a negative report. I was bothered by the pshat of it because it doesn't fit the pshat of the story of the spies at all. But it fits exactly this moment in history, because they kept coming back to Gilgal, specifically because it was easier. It was where the camp was. It was where Yehoshua was. It was where the Mishkan was. But if you do that, you're never going to settle your land. So Yehoshua pushes them. And now Shiloh will become, from the center of the land, the new Merkaz Ruchani, the new spiritual center, the new place of the Mishkan, the Ol Moed. Permanent. It was a bayit. It was made out of stone. But it had the carryover of the Mishkan of the desert. It would represent the Shekhinah. And from there, the tribes would go and conquer their land. That's the Shiloh plan. Now, So again, it's a variation in Rashi, but it's the opposite side of Rashi's interpretation. But I think it stems from Rashi's observation in this text. With the remaining 4 minutes that we have, I want to address a very important historical question, which was how successful was the Shiloh plan? Meaning, Yehoshua sent the Mishkan to Shiloh with the intention of it becoming the central place around which the avoda, the Mishkan, the Mikdash, the role of the temple, the role of the sanctuary, the spiritual anchor of life, Jewish life, Elam Menucha and Nachala, would now find its home in Shiloh, enabling, as Rashi describes it, the conquest of the land, enabling, encouraging, I would call it, the tribes to go out and settle their land because they're close proximity. Shiloh's in the center. They can all get to Shiloh. Shiloh can be the central anchor of spiritual life, each tribe in its place, literally centered around the Mishkan and Shiloh. You couldn't get a more central location than Shiloh. How successful was he at creating that Mishkan Hashem, that place of Avodas Hashem in Shiloh? And unfortunately, the answer we know. The answer was that Shiloh was less successful than we would like it to be. In all of the remaining part of the history of Shiloh, 370 years, the Mishkan and Shiloh stood through all of the remaining part of Sefer Yehoshua, all of Sefer Shoftim, which carries 350 years of history, and the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. What do we hear about Shiloh? What are we told about Shiloh? How much of a role does Shiloh play? So today you can go to the excavations in the old city in Yerushalayim, and every square centimeter of this conversation around the excavations of the Mikdash of Yerushalayim is its role around the Har HaBayit and around the Beit HaMikdash. The Mishkan stood in Shiloh for the same period of time, 369 years. How successful were they? Shiloh is mentioned one other time in Sefer Yehoshua, the beginning of Perek Chaf Bet, when there's a misunderstanding between Pinchas and the tribes. For some reason don't know why my computer is lagging. Can you all see and hear me? Yes? I don't know why my website's lagging, but okay. Yehoshua is let's do it here on the source page. No, I didn't put it on the source page. That's not going to help me. Yeah. Okay. Yehoshua Perek Bet is they gather together in Shiloh. Pinchas leads them in a effort to go to war against the tribe of Reuven and Gad, because Reuven and Gad built a Mizbeach on the east side of the Jordan. So they were not happy. So they go to war. They go to war with. So they gathered together. Shiloh They gathered together in Shiloh to begin a campaign, a war against first civil war, potential civil war in Israel. It was averted for the last minute, and misunderstanding was clarified. Didn't happen, but the next reference of Shiloh in Sefer Yehoshua was a gathering point for war against a fellow tribe. That doesn't bode well. In Shoftim, what happened to Shoftim? Shoftim disappeared. Okay, let's see if we can do this. Shoftim. No, okay. I'm going to stop sharing because my sharing got working. So you're just going to have to listen. Next moment of Shiloh's history is referenced in the beginning of in the end of Sefer Shoftim, where there is a major civil war against the tribe of Binyamin, a story called Pilegesh Begiva. Actually, it's mentioned one place earlier. It's mentioned in the story of the idol of Micha. And the reference there is that the people of Israel went to the idol of Micha in the north because it was more hospitable, because it was more whatever there was. Vayikalu kol hadat ben Israel They went and they placed the pesel, the idol of Micha, in the land of Dan where they had made, in the temple, and it stood there Kol Yemei Hayot Beit Elokim b'Shiloh. For all the years that the Mishkan stood in Shiloh, the idol of Micha stood and operated in the north. That's the next reference to Shiloh. That the idol of Micha operated for all the years that the Mishkan stood in Shiloh. And the last reference of Shiloh, before its final chapter, is the civil war with Binyamin, Pilegesh Begiva, where again they gathered together in Shiloh to go to war against Binyamin. In all of Sefer Shoftim, there's no reference anywhere to the people coming to Shiloh, to the Mishkan in Shiloh, to the tabernacle, to bring their offerings, to bring their sacrifices, to be inspired, to be enhanced, to hear Birchas Kohanim. Nothing. And then we get to the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, and by chapter 4, the Mishkan is destroyed. And the only thing we read about the Mishkan in Shiloh, in Sefer Shmuel, it's 350, 370 years later, is that Hannah can't get to offer her prayer in Shiloh because there are two sons of Eli there controlling the shots, and the sons of Eli are B'nai Belial, no Yaduat Hashem, are worthless people who don't know God and who don't know morality and who are committing all kinds of terrible sins. And because of the sins of the corruption of the sons of Eli, God says to Shaul, no, God says to Eli, sorry, let's do that again. God says to Eli that Eli and his two sons are going to die in the same day that the Mishkan is going to be destroyed. And that's how Sefer Shmuel begins. Sefer Shmuel begins with the destruction of Shiloh. In other words, everything about Shiloh was a failure. And it was a tragic failure because it had all the potential to be, says Rabbi Yosef Karo, could have been Yerushalayim. It could have centered the country. It could have been the permanent place of the Beit HaMikdash. But it stems from the fact that the tribes refused or were hesitant or were lazy or were procrastinated, whatever it was. They weren't able to conquer the land properly, despite the effort to move the tabernacle to Shiloh, to enable them, to push them to finish the conquest of Israel. That's the tragedy of the second half of Sefer Yehoshua. In a nutshell, it's summarized around this move of the Mishkan to Shiloh. Everything else now is going to be the last chapters of Yeshua's life. And then we're going to jump straight to the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, which picks up from exactly this failure. Sefer Shoftim opens with the fact that the Canaanites are still in their midst because the Israelites were unable to conquer the remaining territory that they were challenged and told and mandated to conquer and to settle. That's the bridge. It starts in our chapter and it goes straight to Shoftim chapter 1. Which summarizes all the tribes that were unable to conquer the Canaanites, despite having tried to move the Mishkan to Shiloh to do so. And that's what the story of Shoftim will begin. That's the Shiloh plan, as I call it, and affectionately or otherwise. And I'm happy to stop here and take questions, although I'm 5 minutes past my time. I apologize for that.
Yasher Koach, Shulman.
Gardner, it's always good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent here. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Now, I think you clarified something and gave a real understandable platform as to what the failures were at the time. In other words, what happened?
Right.
It's really good. It gives direction. I think your analysis is really clarifies the situation of what was going on in Yeshua's time.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Thank you. Good night.